Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC Streams session, Revisiting a Partition. What can we learn from Bengal's untold story? With author and former ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee and author, columnist, and conservationist Sudeep Chakrabarti. This conversation is built around a narrative about the partition of Bengal, a beloved part of erstwhile India. Can there be closure to the partition, not only for the generation who lived through the experience, but also the later generations who seem to subconsciously carry the burden of it? Will we ever be able to finally move on, leaving a painful national legacy behind? We hope to reflect on these questions and more during today's session. Bios of both the speakers will appear in the chat box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have questions, comments, or observations to share, feel free to use the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen next to the chat box, and the speakers will address them towards the end of the session. And with that, I hand it over to Sudeep.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening for a conversation with Ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee on her book, a very crucial book on the Bengal partition. And before I go ahead, I'd like to share with you a special connection in a way that I have with Ambassador Mukherjee, is that when she was a few years into the Foreign Service, and I was still in my final year of university, she had taken it upon herself, and I knew her parents, and I'd visit her home because her younger sister and I were batchmates, if you will. And she had taken it upon herself to suggest to me repeatedly that I join the Indian Foreign Service. I'm delighted to say that I declined because I have a propensity for being undiplomatic. So I think I would write it off as a lesser kind of passing up for the Foreign Service and probably a gain for journalism. But having said that, a pleasure to see you again, Bhashwati, and a great honor to be with you on the panel at BIC to discuss this very, very important subject. You know, friends, the partition of Bengal is a very fraught subject because for a very key reason is that not many people, beyond the politics of it and beyond the sort of the living history of it, the live history of it, one aspect of it being fraught is also because not many people know about it, even among the Bengalis, because there's sort of a fading history in a way. And in my experience, and I'm sure in Ambassador Mukherjee's as well, because she's reflected it in her book, Bengal Partition, The Untold Story. And that is the fact that there is an overwhelming emphasis on the Punjab partition, if you will, in the overall construct of the partition of India in 1947. And there is a lack of awareness and knowledge about the Bengal partition, let alone the fact that Bengal has actually experienced two partitions. It's something that not even many Bengalis today know about, which is that there was a partition in 1905, which lasted until 1911. And of course, the partition that we've all come to know and engage with or learn about in our history books, the partition in 1947. Now, may I sort of bring Ambassador Mukherjee into the discussion with this introduction, and also to ask her as to whether she shares my reading of it about this sort of this emphasis on the Punjab partition being in academia, in public discourse, in memory, in living history, the sort of absence of the discussion of Bengal partition in this overall narrative of the Indian partition, how damaging is it? And does she feel, I mean, is this one of the reasons what drove you, Ambassador, to attempt a book of this nature? Or is there also a sort of a history of, an overlay of personal history that conflated with your need to tell the story? Could you please share this with us?
Thank you very much, Shudip, and thank you for the introduction. Indeed, the Foreign Service lost a very promising officer, but the academic and journalistic world gained. So you made the right choice. You've asked a very profound and very important question. The issue is that, like you, I was an outstanding student of history. And as I went through the Foreign Service, and having come from a family whose parents had strong roots in Dhaka, Bikrampur on both sides, it always bothered me that the entire partition narrative throughout my Foreign Service career um, was always focused on relations with Pakistan and on the emotive events leading up to the partition of Punjab, the empty trains, the violence, etc. And in the colonial, post-colonial narratives coming from UK, including the Jewel in the Crown, all the TV series, all the movies, even the film, award-winning film on Gandhi, there was an extended emphasis on the partition of the West. So much so that when the Partition Museum came up in Amritsar some years ago, I was amazed to be informed that initially there was no section on the Bengal partition at all. That was put later, possibly because better sense prevailed. And hence, I decided to write this story about a very different partition. The partition, the tragedy of the partition, of the rupture of a syncretic culture, because the unique people of this region were devoted to their language, civilization, and culture rather than religion, which is quite different from the partition which happened in Punjab. And therefore, and I read your book, Shudip, on the Plassey, which was fascinating. I started the book from 1757, the chapter which I have written when Bengal was sold to the British, and I ended it after the creation of Bangladesh, because I found that the issues which started once Bengal was sold to the British, including the famines which came, the development of the communal agenda, the systematic destruction of their syncretic culture, the sowing of doubts, those poisonous seeds which came, the grapes, the poisoned grapes which flowered later, all that led to the tragedy of the first partition, 1905, its reversal, which actually made sure that the second one would come in 47. So the partition of 1905 and its reversal laid the ground for those poisoned grapes which would lead to 47. But it didn't stop in 47, because the partition story of the West, which was based on a different narrative, that is to say of religion, was completely different from the partition story of the East, which was based on language. And when the new masters of West Pakistan tried to eradicate that language, because they had complete contempt for the converted Bengali, for the converted Bengali Muslim, for the Bengali Muslim who recited his Quran in Bengali, who went to Durga Puja, who sang devotional songs for both religions. When they tried to eradicate that language, you had the development of the third partition, which would come in 71. And in that too was the linkage, Shudip, of this man called Sohrawardi, whom I've written about in detail in my book. The infamous man who was linked with the Bengal famine and the great Kolkata killings, who became the mentor of Mujibur Rahman, but never could two people have been more different than Sohrawardi, who spoke Urdu rather than Bengali, who preferred Urdu rather than Bengali, who developed this great affection for Gandhi, because Gandhi was a man of the masses and he could never be a man of the masses. And his affection for Mujib, and Mujib revering this highly educated intellectual with a Western background, not realizing that Sohrawardi loved Mujib for what Sohrawardi was not, a man of the soil whose lyrical Bengali could keep you spellbound for hours. So that is the kind of message which inspired me to read the book. So sorry for my long answer to your short
question. No. Because, we unfortunately, Ambassador, we don't have adequate time, in fact, to discuss something that is needs to be discussed. To my mind, the more time we accord to it, absolutely, the better for it. But I mean, when you brought up Mr. Suhrawardy, I couldn't help go back to an anecdote which I've discussed and written about myself, is the fact that, because he was a bit
about it in your own book, actually, no?
In my own book, in fact, but he had this great sense of, histories, and this is something that I also want to discuss in the course of our conversation, some of the characters, besides Suhrawardy as well, because Suhrawardy was also a bit of a hypocrite, because, he was known, not just his passion for Urdu, in fact, his passion for clipped British accented English, and he had a great love of Scotch whiskey, and he married I don't know if you know, but he married a Russian ballerina.
That was his second wife.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, she was with the Russian ballet company. So, history is full of these grand hypocrites, if you will, or hypocrisies, or, great nuggets of interesting things.
It's funny, Shrudeep, that in many ways, he was so clipped and British like Jinnah, but Jinnah never trusted him, and nor did Liaquat. That's also very interesting.
Well, since you bring it up, who did Jinnah trust anyway? But that's another story for perhaps another day. But this one thing I want to talk about is that in your book, and I don't want to go too deep into the book because it has a lot of valuable technical data, and I want to actually guide our audience, if you will, many of whom may not be familiar with Bengal's history, and let alone its two partitions, and more or less sort of drive them to reading the book rather than just sort of give away everything that you discuss in the book. But having said that, may I ask you, please, as to your opinion? There are many impulses, as always, that lead up to a historical event, or an event in history, or a phase in history, or an era in any part of the world, certainly our part of the world. But besides Plassey, which you begin with, and 71, which you end with, which is like a denouement in a way, what, in your opinion, was sort of the key trigger, if you will, for the partition of 1905, and which sort of segued, if you will, into the partition of 1947, which was, of course, pretty much set in stone in 1946 already. So what, in your mind, were one or two of the key triggers for the first partition of Bengal, and which then led on to the final partition of Bengal?
Again, a very, very important question, Sudeep. In my perspective, which I've written in my book, one of the most important triggers was the role of the Bengal Army in 1857. Now, it is very important for the audience to understand that when 1857 happened, Hindus and Muslims revolted together. The Bengal Army at that time by the British had not been divided on religious lines. In fact, the British throughout had a very poor understanding of what India was, and they continue to have that poor understanding till today. But when 1857 happened, two things occurred. The British decided that these troublesome Bengalis need to be continuously subdued. And they embarked, and I've written it in my book, upon a complete restructuring, not just of the Bengal Army, but all the provincial armies, on religious lines rather than caste lines. Moreover, they did what they did later in Africa too. Those who fought in 1857 against the British, which included basically the East and the South, were regarded as non-martial races. And those who fought with the British, notably the Gurkhas and the Pathans, were notified as martial races. They did exactly the same in Africa some years later. When Africans started getting restless, those who revolted were called non-martial, and those who collaborated were called martial. Once they had restructured that army, because they came perilously close, Sudeep, as you know as a historian, to losing control. soon after 1857 happened, they were actually perilously close to losing control because the British, like most Goras, don't like body bags. And substantial casualties were inflicted in the first 3 months of 1857. So, when this development happened, it also coincided with the rise of the Hindu national movement, which I've explained in my book, which was followed later by the Muslim national movement. But in the Hindu national movement, which happened, there was this identification of the wholeness of the nation, something which the British wanted to deny, and to develop that communal narrative that India, if ever it was going to be free, which at that time the narrative was Indians were not fit to govern themselves, but if ever in the distant future they would get their freedom, since they had been ruled since the 10th century by the Muslims, India from the 10th century had developed into two separate nations, Hindu and Muslim, and this narrative was systematically developed and it found fruition in 1905. In 1905, those who were leading the Hindu national movement were furious at this artificial partition because Dhaka at that time was in any case Hindu majority, and the intellectual roots of the Bengali culture and civilization were strongly anchored in those green plains of East Bengal. When the pressure put by the Hindus and the Bengal Congress became too much to resist, and it was reversed, as you pointed out, the Muslims were furious and thought it was a betrayal and said that they would never rest until it was restored, thereby again setting those poisoned uh, uh, grape seeds of the next partition. So that was the triggering point, 1857 and its aftermath, the role of the Bengal army and the recognition that Bengal is a troublesome province with troublesome people. It was only later that Winston Churchill said other things even more hurtful. But at that time, the recognition was this is a very troublesome region and troublesome people. They need to be divided up on the basis of religion so that if ever there is an uprising again, there will never be a united Hindu-Muslim uprising as what happened in 1857. And I often regret, Sudeep, that many historians have not written about this most important part of 1857, which is that it was a united uprising of Hindus and Muslims against the colonial imperialist.
Well, I'm happy to state that I think the narrative is beginning to change. So maybe there are braver historians, and maybe India has now matured close to 75th year of its independence into a nation that has gone beyond the initial years of nation building narrative, if you will, and is now able to basically mature to a great extent and question many things in our past. So that's a fine thing, and I hope more of that happens. I can't help but again recollect another aspect about one of the key sponsors key supporters of Nathaniel Curzon, Lord Curzon, in 1905 for the first partition of Bengal, Nawab Salimullah Dhaka. And in fact, he was the chief patron of the formation of what came to be later known as the Muslim League, because he hosted all the Muslim leaders.
Bengal's greatest capitalist was his title.
Well, I can quibble with you about that, because he came at it from a sort of a tangential cloak. Yeah. Yes, indeed. And but with the he wore the cloak of emancipation of the Muslim of Eastern India at that time, or indeed Greater India. So I mean, he was the first meeting of that league. So-called league happened in Ehsan Manzil, which was his own residence in Dhaka, as you know. Yeah. But there's a joke actually. I mean, but it's true. It's a true joke. I mean, there is a thing that I came across correspondence that alluded to the fact that the Nawab was actually, as much as he politically went in for or sort of politically supported the partition of Bengal in 1905, he was also helped along by the substantial loan that he had personally received from the government of India, courtesy of Lord Curzon. So Nathaniel Curzon had a bit of a leverage on the Nawab of Dhaka to push through the 1905 partition. But that's another. I love these little anecdotes of history. You'll have to forgive me
Very
for
true.
cutting in on that. But
I've
you know,
heard
when we discuss the aspect of religion, one
yes.
of the things that has struck me, because this is something that I've been attempted to study through my own work as well, and which conflicts with much of the research that you've done for your book, is that you know it appears that to the rest of the world and also to the greater uh, world of Bengalis, which I tend to call Bangla sphere, that when the partition happened in 1947, it was as if people just woke up and said, what the hell? I mean, when did Bengal become Musalman, or when did Bengal turn Muslim? Most people don't realize that Bengal, actually Greater Bengal, which was former East, West, North, and of course the bit of Bengal that has now gone to Assam also as a part of partition. Barak Valley was part of Greater Bengal before partition, as you know. But when I look back at this, I can't help but recollect uh, that there has been a steady ingress of Islam in the northern part of Greater Bengal and the central east part, and definitely the deltaic part of Bengal, from the time, for instance, of the person who's today the patron saint of Bangladesh, Shah Jalal. I mean, he died in 1346 in Sylhet, and I visited his mausoleum there, which is greatly revered. And I couldn't help but notice that there is one room which is very sacred, which contains the saint's armory. So here you have a Sufi saint who was also a warrior saint, and that is a tradition that in the early years of Islam's ingress into Eastern India, was very much a part of the proselytizing aspect of the religion. I would imagine that through the later centuries, when the conquest or the absorption, if you will, of Bengal into the Sultanate and later into the Mughal era happened, that they became from active, brutal, or aggressive proselytization, which is standard in many, many religions that need to sort of set forth and conquer, became a sort of a gentler conversion, if you will, for sort of reaching out. Then the syncretism that you referred to earlier began to develop, a sort of a reaching out to a more folksy Islam, which appeal in a way to many, many Hindus who might feel that they had a better deal going with many aspects of Islam or by becoming Muslims. Many, many reasons. There's no one reason for this. There are several reasons. But this is something that I can't help but bring up, this steady uh, spread of, and it just didn't happen overnight. This is something that happened over several centuries, and this is something that most people don't realize. They just sort of wake up and said, hey, I thought Bengalis, I mean, what happened? And they don't even realize that the 2/3 of the world's Bengalis are in Bangladesh, and 90% and more of them are Muslim. So, you know, people don't really understand the dynamics of where we as Bengalis have come from and how this whole religious narrative or the divide and rule narrative that you introduced in the conversation happened. Could you tell us a little about that, about how
Sure.
you view
I've
this
written about
growth? Indeed,
extensively
indeed,
in my book.
indeed,
I
indeed.
have explained that when the earliest conversions took place,
Hmm.
it's very important, first of all, to understand that when the Muslims came to India, 10th century, all the way up till Plassey, the revenue collection was done by the Bengali Marwari Hindu and later by the Jamindar. So the Muslims, the Muslim ruler from Delhi did not convert, did not touch the ruling elite or the revenue collecting system of Bengal. The conversions happened among the peasantry who were exploited, both Hindus and later on the Muslims. And they came from the lowest caste of the Hindus because of social discrimination. They converted. When they converted, they did not want to adopt what they considered to be a foreign language, which is Urdu. They did not understand the Quran Sharif in Urdu. So they developed on those rice swamps of Bengal a completely different, as you rightly pointed out, folksy, Sufistic Islam, a soft Islam, syncretic Islam, with syncretic Hinduism, where, as I've written in my book, it was very moving to see those poems which were about both Sufi saints and Hindu saints, and which later on carried down all the way to Nazrul, who has written such beautiful songs about Hinduism that if you would look at those songs, you'd think, hey, was Nazrul Hindu or Muslim? And so it originated from there. When the people have asked me, you've written about forced conversions. There were some forced conversions, no doubt. Some conversions also happened because some of the peasants moved to different forms of cultivation, of agriculture. And some conversions happened because there were those who came, the Sufi peers, etc., went from village to village and converted. But what is very important to understand is that at the grassroots level, the Islam and the Hindu lived in a syncretic culture without any difficulty until the colonizer came. At the elite level, the Muslim and the Hindu lived together, united in their purpose, which was the exploitation of the peasantry. But there was one very important difference too, which I've written in my book, that in Bengal, when famines happened before Plassey, the Muslim ruler from Delhi, who considered himself to be an Indian, not a foreigner, always reduced the tribute. The first and most devastating famine that happened after Plassey, where 10 million Bengalis died, was because the East India Company, and I always say that please don't regard the Muslims in the north as foreigners, because if they were foreigners, they would have done the same. But the East India Company tripled the tribute and left these 10 million peasants to die of starvation. And that continued all the way up till 1942, where there is a full chapter on the great tragedy of 2.3 million Bengalis dying of starvation in 1942. So this story of how the northern part of Bengal got people, and then they moved the swampy part is in the eastern part of Bengal. But there was this intrinsic intellectual connect between the Hindu and Muslim elite and the peasant in a way, because that culture was integrated in the language. And that is why when the whole issue is that the Bengali identity was linked to Bengali and not to the religion, has persisted till today. And that is something that is so unique about the eastern part of India, that again was one of the reasons which compelled me to write this book. Sudeep.
Well, you'd be very happy to know, Ambassador, that on the walls of the Bangla Academy in Dhaka, which prides itself, much to the consternation of the snobs of Kolkata, as the sort of the repository of Bengali culture, if you will, and literary oeuvre, there are quotes from Rabindranath Tagore, Nazrul Islam, and Sufis and Bauls, on the wall of Bangla Academy. So I mean that they acknowledge the syncretism of culture, and in fact there is great respect linguistically and culturally for writers which transcend. And I mean, as you know, that after the liberation of Bangladesh after 1971, the government of Mujibur Rahman actually formally requested India to let them have Nazrul Islam, who was by then unfortunately suffering from great dementia, and brought him into Dhaka, to Bangladesh, to spend his last years, and treated him with the greatest courtesy. And now he's the national poet of Bangladesh. So there is a great, and he's a person who was born in Asansol, in West Bengal. So I mean, there's great syncretism. There's one thing that I just found it very curious in when we talk about Bengal, is that it just pains me to sometimes see that the breakdown of a sort of a folksy syncretism that has held Bengal together for so many hundreds of years through many wars. I mean, let's not forget that when when the Mughals came into Bengal, as you also say, it was Raja Man Singh who actually fought with the Sultanate appointed sultans of Bengal, the Nawabs of Bengal. So you had Islamist rulers of Bengal already who were fighting the Mughals. at that particular point of time. So it is sort of a very, very fascinating thing. So from there, that time when you had a sense of unity of Bengal, you had a sense of the rulers, whether they were Hindu or Muslim in Bengal, uh, taking ownership, if you will, in the best possible way of the region and its economy, most importantly, which is what attracted the British into Bengal and other Europeans in the first place. From then to sort of see this split and the devastation that began from 1905. You have situations of rioting in 1920s, some in 1930s, and of course 1946, the Great Calcutta killing, which you write about, and subsequently in 47.
And don't forget Noakhali. Yeah.
Indeed, and so yeah, I've actually visited these places to see things for myself. But uh, unfortunately, it's actually continued. The divisiveness has continued beyond the independence of India and Pakistan into the rioting that you had in 1950, into the rioting that you had in 1964 in East Pakistan. Then, because of a absolutely unrelated incident in Hazratbad over a fracas over the destruction of a hair of the prophet, and the sort of the domino effect of the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992, which led to a lot of bloodshed in then Bangladesh, what had become Bangladesh. So it just pains me to see this and hear about these things because there's so much of syncretic history. But there's one thing that I find curious, and I would like your opinion, Ambassador, is that which is that in Bangladesh, which is 2/3 of the world's Bengalis live over there, 90% of there are Bengali.
You keep saying that, and I feel so sad to hear you say that.
So I know it's true. No, it's true. So which is why, because when people say that Bengalis don't have, no, I know, but when people say, Ambassador, Bengalis don't have business sense, they don't ask the government billionaires in Bangladesh. All of the billionaires in Bangladesh are Bengali. When they say that Bengalis don't have martial prowess, they don't ask it of the chiefs of staff of Army, Navy, and Air Force of Bangladesh, who are all Bengali. So these myths are also perpetuated, rooted in the British myth making that happened after 1857. So your point is very well taken. But what I wanted to ask your opinion on, and then I'd take the conversation to another place, is that I find it very curious that there is this great dismissal, if you will, or ignorance, willful ignorance in Bangladesh of this syncretic history. And there's a sort of a blind spot that I find in my research and writing when I talk to people, that after 1757, after this loss of Siraj ud-Daulah, who they very greatly praise, to 1971, there is this, as if there's this sort of black hole. So in Bangladeshi history, in even what is taught in schools and colleges, and even what is acknowledged in official history after 1971, it is as if their life began, history in Bangladesh began in 1971 and not before. And there is this sort of great willful ignorance, a washing away of this syncretic culture, which sort of deteriorated into this divisive culture over many decades. And now this sort of upsurge in Bangladesh, if you will, of the economy and culture and their own maturity. There seems to be this black hole. Do you feel that, I mean, have you thought about this? Have you, I know you've dealt with it in part in your book, but
I have dealt with it also in my book. You see, the thing is that it is a black hole because it's due to severe embarrassment. If you look at the Great Calcutta killings and the linkage of Sohrawardi as the then Chief Minister of Bengal and how he orchestrated the killings of Hindus, then if you move to the chapter on Noakhali and the forced conversion of Hindus, the terrorizing, etc., it would appear to an impartial student of history of Bengal that during that period, once the communal narrative and the poison had been put in the minds of the Bengali Muslim by the British, the Bengali Muslim leaders like Sohrawardi, not everybody, thought that only by unleashing violence on the Hindus, particularly the Bhadralok on one hand, and the Marwaris on the other, whom they considered to be non-martial races and very afraid of violence. They thought that's the only way they could control the political narrative moving inexorably towards partition. What happened thereafter was there was also a severe embarrassment that they ultimately in 47 enthusiastically accepted that the reason for partition is religious and not linguistic. And that in 71, they reversed their own decision by demonstrating that Muslims fought Muslims because not for religion, but for language and culture. So it is from their perspective, Sudeep, very embarrassing. How do you justify it? How do you justify Sohrawardi? How do you justify the fact, as I've written in my book, that 2 days before partition, he begged Gandhi to spend 2 nights with him in a neutral residence, which Gandhiji did. What explains that Sohrawardi was afraid of going back to East Pakistan at that point? He was afraid he would be liquidated in East Pakistan, and he was afraid that if Gandhiji left Kolkata, he would be liquidated by the Hindus who were furious by what he had done, first for the famine and then for the killings. And then he reinvented himself, got himself a Bengali coach, learned how to speak Bengali properly, and went back to Bangladesh. Now, if you say all this to a Bengali audience in Bangladesh, they would be absolutely astounded on one hand and grief stricken on the other, which is probably the reason why, Sudeep, and I'll end here, that in my entire career in the Foreign Service, whenever I met the Bangladeshi ambassador, he always expressed surprise that I spoke such fluent Bengali, that I can sing Rabindra Sangeet, and that I am so acquainted with Bengali history, almost as if he regarded me as a foreigner because I came from the Indian part of Bengal. So if the Indian part of Bengal refuses to accept the other side does not accept that there is any Bengal beyond their borders, that all other people living on the other side, these are Indians who have given up the Bengali language and culture. So it's a very, very complex narrative.
Well, I'm sure that. Well, I'm sure the ambassador that you speak of couldn't have been Farooq Soban, and if he were, I'd be heartbroken because he had a far more syncretic worldview of life.
It wasn't Farooq Soban. No.
I would imagine, which is why I mentioned the name, because it doesn't sound like that ambassador.
No, it was not Farooq Soban.
I mean, that is a syncretic family, but I'm very happy to again share with you that in my extensive travels in Bangladesh, and as I said that I didn't take the exam, sit for the exam for the Foreign Service, so I continue to be completely undiplomatic throughout my career, and I'm very happy to say that in my interactions in Bangladesh,
I find you very diplomatic, Sudeep.
In my own interactions in Bangladesh, I've actually been pretty blunt and shared this aspect of history. And they've listened. So maybe that the generational negativity or the generational embarrassment that you had of the people who'd seen come through partition in many ways like the generation in India had, which is why you have the sort of blinkers that both these generations had put on, and they would sort of pass on their poison to subsequent generations, literally poison the children as well through the hurt and the devastation that they themselves had. Maybe in both countries, in Bangladesh and India, and definitely to some extent in Eastern India as well, that maybe the generations have moved on, subsequent generations have gathered knowledge and a hunger for, and a sense of maturity, which allows us to discuss it in far more sort of critical terms and far more openly without this great engagement of blind passion or blind rage, if you will, or blind hurt. Now there, I find another thing that is a bit interesting, Ambassador, is that, or Bhasha Didi, and I think I should call you that now, for the sake of Bengali syncretism and Bengali culture, for the sake of the family.
Into you, yes.
I hope so. And the thing is that unlike, and this is a sense of continuity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have written the book. We wouldn't be having this animated adda, as we call it in Bangla, in a way about such a crucial aspect of our history, of not just Bengali history, of the history of three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Let's not forget that Bengal's partition involves three present-day countries, not one, and not one region alone. So there's a sense of continuity that goes on to this, it comes with us to this day. And unlike in Punjab, where to my mind, partition is more or less a settled aspect in some ways, as it were. It's a matter of history and memory rather than a living memory and a living history. It's gone from what your dadi and dada and nani and nana told you. That generation is sort of passed on or is in the process of passing on. And the new generations are far more settled and more so getting on with life. But there is, in West Bengal, for instance, or in present-day Bangladesh, partition is still living history. It's still very much alive because the sort of the divisiveness that we both discussed a little earlier continues to the present day. In fact, in the last assembly elections, which just took place, we're just fresh from it. The very fact that it was so communal or communalized for the second time around, in the last time around as well as this time around, 2016 as well as 2021, is a living proof, is a proof of the continuance of partition right up until 2021. So for me, at least, and I would love to hear your views on this, partition, unfortunately, in many ways, even though there is greater acceptance of what's gone on in the past, but this great leverage that partition has for people who want to make hate their trade, whether they're Hindu or Muslim, is irrelevant for me at this particular point. I'm talking about those who live with the leverage of hatred to further their own ends. For them, and ergo for their intended audience, the partition of Bengal continues to be living history. Would you like to share your thoughts
Yes,
on
absolutely.
this?
I have commented extensively, actually, Sudeep, on this issue.
Yes.
Been asked
Yes.
about it. What I've said is that it is very important for people who live outside Bengal, particularly those who live in North India, actually, to understand a couple of things which are very important. One is that Bengalis have a deep sense of history. Now, in the crucial decades leading up to the first partition of 1905 and then the second, the way the Bengal Congress leadership was treated by the Indian National Congress leadership for various reasons. That is unfinished business. Subhash Chandra Bose is unfinished business. His advice, which was not taken into account for legitimate reasons by the history of the Lucknow Pact, that's unfinished business. The amended communal award is unfinished business because while it was good for the rest of India, it gave Hindus finally lesser seats than the Muslims for legitimate reasons. That is all unfinished business. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the collapse of the KPP, because the Bengali Bhadralok did not want to take up the whole issue of peasant reform. That is unfinished business. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, his agenda and how he tried to cooperate with the Congress, but it didn't happen. That's unfinished business. But more than anything else, it has left the Bengali, like in the South, like in Tamil Nadu, a very deep suspicion of people who come from outside, even if they want to offer a better development narrative. For such people to succeed, and I have said this, they have to live there, they have to grow their roots there, they have to tell the Bengali they are not vegetarian, that for them the fish is a vegetable, right? They have to understand what makes a Bengali clique, which is that the fish is purchased by the man of the house at 8 p.m. Then there is a discussion at home as to how it will be cooked. It is cooked at 9 p.m. and eaten at 10:30 p.m. Now you tell that to a good law-abiding Punjabi living in Delhi, where I've lived all my life, and they are absolutely horrified. So there are many issues which are unfinished. Some are political, some are cultural. As far as the poisoned narrative is concerned, in my opinion, that's a very dangerous game to play, because it is completely erroneous for the rest of India to think that the Bengali Bhadralok or the Bengali is a law-abiding, non-violent citizen, because as the great Calcutta killings have shown, and as Noah Khali showed, the Bengali Hindu or Muslim is as capable of violence as anywhere else in India.
Indeed.
To redevelop those poisoned grapes for whatever political purpose is highly dangerous and highly avoidable. That's what I've always said, Sudeep. I'm sure you agree with me.
No, well, touche. And yeah, I mean, it's difficult to, because this is very complicated, but I couldn't help
Very
notice that you were actually describing, for a while there, Ambassador, you were not really describing the history of the Bengali people, but the idiosyncrasies of the Bengali people. When you talked about that.
I'm very Bengali myself, so I can't help it.
Well, I think that's something, that's another thing that people need to understand. I think the people who gel best in Bengal are the people who probably understood this sort of the syncretism that idiosyncrasies brought together as well. I mean, we are a greatly idiosyncratic people with our own culturally idiosyncratic, and we're very proud of it. In fact, you recall what Ibn Battuta said, that Bengal was a hell full of good things. And I'm not sure that he was talking about the Bengali people that he encountered.
I'm not sure he meant it as a compliment, yeah.
As a compliment in the 14th century. But there's one thing that, which leads on, actually, there's something that I wanted to lead on from our last point of discussion,
Yes.
In terms of remembrance and memory and continuation and respect. And maybe after that, if it's okay with you,
Sure.
we'll throw open the discussion to the fine people
some
of the
questions in the Q&A.
Yes, that young Lekha from the Bangalore International Center will take care of that for us.
Sure.
So she's hereby put on standby for looking at the questions. But what I want to discuss with you is about this fact of memory and life history. And you brought up right in the beginning, in your opening remarks, about the Partition Museum in Amritsar and your
there is a section on the
Indeed. And but you were aghast and surprised at in the beginning, and it's a true story that they didn't really think of this partition of Bengal as being worthy.
I spoke to the curator myself. Yeah.
Indeed. But again, what is good is that I had people reaching out to me, and I'm very happy to share with you and others who are joining the discussion that there is, in fact, now a Kolkata Partition Museum, as formally as of 2018, that has been established by an academician called Rituparna Roy, who's an academic.
And she used to live in Netherlands, where I was ambassador.
Indeed. In fact, she was on a fellowship at Leiden, at the University of Leiden.
I have met her,
Indeed. So, I mean, as you know, Leiden's a very liberal university. So, I mean, they were open to it. In fact, the colleagues and the people that Rituparna met, or I should call her Dr. Roy, because she's after a PhD, and Dr. Roy met at Leiden during her year of fellowship. There are some people from that time, during her engagement at that time, have actually actively helped the establishing of the Kolkata Partition Museum, which it's up and running. It's in 2018. They have a website. There's some very, very fine people from West Bengal, India, the Netherlands, and Bangladesh who are on the board of trustees. And there are people who are there as advisors and people who just volunteers. So there is a beginning, if you will, a small beginning, but to my mind, a significant beginning. And universities like Kalyani University and others are actually introducing partition as subjects, introducing modern Bengali history, which has a lot of overlay of political history as active subjects for dissertation, research and dissertations. So these are good things that are beginning to happen. And perhaps here, because we've sort of put out a general kind of a fabric, a katha, if you will, as we say it in Bangla, with this broad katha, the hand-stitched katha of Bengali history, Bengali partition, Bengal's partition, and sort of the political history up to the present day, if you will. And hoping to offer our viewers and listeners a little understanding, those who are not Bengali, of course, and Bengalis know everything, so my apologies for even presuming that you don't know what we are talking about. My sincere apologies. But those who are not Bengali, for those guests and viewers and listeners, I hope that it's presented enough of a platform to lead up to any questions that you might have, ladies and gentlemen. So I'd bring in Lekha, I'd invite Lekha at this point to share with Ambassador Mukherjee some questions that the audience might have for her.
Sure, Sudeep.
Lekha?
Yeah, these questions are slowly filtering in.
No problem.
Yeah. M. Kumar asks if you would like to comment on the recent elections, the West Bengal elections, in context of the partition of undivided Bengal.
I think M. Kumar, Sudeep is Madhu Kumar, who is my younger sister's best friend and a good friend of yours too. So she's hiding her identity, I think. Can you read out the question again, Lekha? What was it?
They ask if
shall I look in the Q&A maybe? No.
No, I think it's something that you addressed. You've already touched upon in the aspect a little bit earlier about how partition may have contributed to the dynamics of the recent Bengal elections. But maybe M. Kumar wants a more detailed answer rather than a sort of a historical answer, a more current answer.
I think I have inadvertently clicked something and I've gone off. So now what do I do?
I can hear you. I can see you, hear you.
You just have to click on the icon, the Zoom icon, and you'll be back on screen. At the bottom of your screen.
Don't know how this happened.
Ambassador Mukherjee will be shortly back with us.
Yeah.
Not a problem at all. Lekha, could you give me a sense of some of the questions that are coming in so I can guide Ambassador Mukherjee? She's rejoined, so it's all right.
Yeah,
she's back with us.
Yeah.
You can just read the question again.
Yeah, she's back with us.
Yes.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
M. Kumar would like you to comment on the recent elections in the context of the partition of undivided Bengal.
Well, actually, the elections are not really directly connected to the partition of undivided Bengal. But as I mentioned in my conversation with Sudeep, there are unfinished issues of emanating from that partition, which influence the politics of Bengal. One of them being, for instance, the refugee issue, the illegals who come in, the fear of being swamped by outsiders because Bengal has been partitioned once, they've lost land, they've lost territory, etc. And then there is this whole issue of the preservation of the Bengali culture. And there is this suspicion that somebody from outside Bengal may not understand local issues as much as a Bengali can. And therefore, as I said to Sudeep, that for any party to succeed in Bengal, it needs patience, it needs time, and you have to grow your roots there, and you have to develop your supporters there. So it's not directly linked, but it is also an indication. The results show that the party which gave a strong challenge to the ruling party actually ended up with quite a large percentage of the popular vote. So that demonstrates that there are certain issues there which, if properly handled by the party with challenge to the ruling party, could bring them back to power in future. Because in this particular election, it would appear that the Bhadralok vote, the left-leaning Bengali intellectual intelligentsia went with the ruling party, but there are many issues in that support which could dissipate or which could change. So it's a very fluid situation in Bengal, and one should keep that in mind when one looks at the election results, which also probably explains why so much violence happened post the election in Bengal. I hope that was okay, Sudeep. I maybe covered.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine. And in fact, there's an interesting aspect that, I mean, the election, I mean, some of the post-election aspect of violence that took place was also less on account of the seeds or the fruits of partition, if you will, and more about political rivalry.
Yeah.
So it's less to do with religion and partition and the partition history than present-day political.
Conflicting development narratives.
Indeed. And also a sort of in Bangla, there's a lovely word called resha reshi. So I think it's sort of the detritus of the egos that were blunted as a cause of the elections and its outcome. I think, carried over into post-election violence when there was a sort of a, let me show you, do you think that you can do this to me? So it was, I think, more political than religion-led or history-led in the post-election violence.
I agree.
But an interesting aspect, Ambassador, is that the current dispensation, the incumbent government of West Bengal would sort of regain power I would hate to use the word power. Convincing and unlike the narrative which was put out before, actually the amount of the Muslim vote that the Trinamool Congress received is actually 20% of only a fifth of the total of Trinamool votes.
Yes, because I said that the Bhadralok vote.
Exactly.
Trinamool. So the Muslim vote got divided by the alliance.
Indeed.
Bhadralok vote, which they did not get in 2014, the Bhadralok vote went to Trinamool. So it's a very fluid situation.
Indeed.
Since it's Bengal, it can change any time,
Indeed. And I brought up the statistic because it played into the argument that you made. Lekha, could you please share with us the next question?
Yes. As an aside, it wasn't the M. Kumar that you were thinking, but a non-Bengali who loves all things Bengali is being
How lovely. How very wonderful.
Lovely.
Next question is from Abhijit Sengupta. He apologizes that he has...
Abhijit Sengupta is former Secretary Culture.
Yes.
We call him Gabida, if he's the same person. Hi. What's his question? It must be very tricky. If I know him, it'll be a very tricky question. What is it?
How have you dealt with the difficult times of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee as a member of the Bengal government? In the book.
In the book, I have referred to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's efforts to find common ground with the Congress. How there were conflicting ideologies, and how Shyama Prasad Mukherjee actually at one point even tried to do a deal with the Muslim League, and how Shyama Prasad Mukherjee finally at one point even thought that a united Bengal, that is to say no partition of Bengal, was better than Bengal going with Pakistan and India, something which is not very well known actually. So I have dealt with it, but I haven't gone into so much of detail because there was actually, I had a word limit set by my publisher. And moreover, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee himself as an individual, his contribution to politics deserves a book by itself, because there is a lot of misunderstanding about him, about the fact that he initially actually was quite reasonable in many ways, and that he actually felt that the Congress command in Delhi was ill-treating the Bengal Congress, and the Bengal Congress and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee actually didn't have many differences. So again, it is a very interesting issue, again linked to the communal narrative and how the communal narrative played out in the eyes of the Indian National Congress based in Delhi, and in the eyes of the Bengal Congress sitting on a local spot and seeing for themselves the numbers, how the numbers shift, because if you have separate constituencies, which was again the nail in the coffin of Indian unity brought out by the British, they also tried at some point, and Gandhiji saved India by fasting in the Pune jail. They wanted to have separate constituency also for the lower caste people. That would have been the end of India as we know it. So these were very complex times, and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee actually I find to be one of the most interesting individuals at that point of time. He deserves actually much more attention than I have given to him in my book because of lack of space. Gabida, thank you.
Lekha, the next one, please.
Yes, this is from an anonymous attendee. The MEA did not send Bengali officers to Bangladesh, people who would understand the culture of the people and would be able to interact with the people there. Why do you think that happened?
Well, actually, the opposite happened.
Exactly.
In the sense that the MEA has a policy of encouraging Bengali-speaking officers to get posted to Bengal, to Bangladesh. I actually have a different take on it, which I'll share with you. which is that in the early years of the Foreign Service, when I joined in 76, I found it much easier to interact with a Pakistani than with a Bangladeshi after 71, because my narrative had been poisoned by what I had been told by the elders in my family. Same was true for Indian Punjabis and Pakistani Punjabis. I actually stuck my neck out and advocated at one point when I was head of administration that we should think of sending, for instance, a Bengali like me for a posting in Pakistan and a proper Punjabi, tandoori chicken eating Punjabi to Bangladesh on a posting, because they don't have any historical baggage, they have no cultural baggage. They would look at the issue only as an Indian diplomat in accordance with national interests, no baggage. Unfortunately, no one listened to me. So the opposite is true. You have Bengali officers going to Bangladesh, and you have Punjabi officers, North Indian officers, people who understand Urdu, people who know the history and background going to Pakistan. So that is actually the policy. So I don't know how this impression has been given that MEA does not post Bengali officers.
But,
And if they have posted also a non-Bengali officer, they usually all end up learning Bengali. Sorry, Shudeep, you wanted to say something?
no, but in fact, I was going to add to what you're saying, because again, it's a generational shift. Maybe this baggage that you speak of, Ambassador, happened
Was in my time.
Well, you're not that far back. What do you mean your time? Give
Thank
yourself
you.
a break.
I'm actually very old, but thank you.
No, please, you're not. You're doing just fine. I mean that actually even before your time, too. Now let me tease you a little. I remember, if I'm not wrong, Ambassador Pinakaranjan Chakravarti was Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka.
Yeah.
He was posted to Dhaka. In fact,
by
I
the
met
way,
him at
he's
DHC.
1 year junior to me, Shudeep. Okay. Pinna.
Okay, so then, okay. So,
And he became High
was,
Commissioner also. Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed. So I've met him at Dhaka when he was Deputy High Commissioner. And in fact, he was welcomed. His interaction with the locals were excellent. The government got along very well with him. And in fact, the current Foreign Secretary, Harshvardhan Shringla, is a former High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh.
He speaks Bengali also.
Harsh speaks fluent Bangla.
Fluent Bangla.
In fact, I personally have been hosted in the High Commission to discuss my book, The Bengalis, in which the creme de la creme of Dhaka has been invited. And all these tricky issues we discussed earlier this evening have been discussed threadbare in front of that audience. So maybe the times are changing as well. Maybe there is again the sense of maturity and there's less baggage. Sorry for the interjection, but I couldn't help.
No, it must be true, I'm sure. In fact, the Pakistani ambassador in Paris told me that in the earlier generation of Pakistani officers used to have this visceral hatred for India, and the new generation of Pakistani officers in the Foreign Service don't have that. So the people have moved on in all the three countries, not just in India. I fully agree.
All to the good. Lekha, the next one, please, for Ambassador Mukherjee.
Next one is from Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Of course, you know her.
Of course, she was my foreign secretary.
And
here. Yeah.
She compliments on the fascinating discussion, and she has a question. She asks you to tell about a little bit about the Bengali-speaking diaspora around the world, and if you see that there is the same sense of linguistic nationalism among them, regardless the religious affiliation. And there is also an anecdote which is a little bit longish about her meeting the American Congressman Hanson Clark in 2011, who was of mixed Bengali and African American heritage, and how
she was foreign secretary at that time. Yeah, possibly.
Yes, so she'd like you to talk about the diaspora.
Right. So hi Nirupama, thank you for joining. Actually, my direct experience with the Bengali diaspora was when I was sent by you as ambassador to Netherlands. And I discovered that the Bengali diaspora in Netherlands never had a Durga Puja. So as the first Bengali ambassador to the Netherlands, I organized the first Bengali Durga Puja, which continues till today. And I encouraged the Bangladeshis and the Bangladeshi High Commission people to join us. I'm sorry to report that they were not that enthusiastic in the beginning, but they did come for the food which we gave, because it was excellent Bengali food. And that is when I realized that again, this is a cultural thing, as Shudip and I discussed, which is that whenever the Bengali Indian Bengali demonstrates strong cultural roots for Bengal, this makes the Bangladeshi feel uncomfortable. So it is quite interesting that I discovered this on my own. And then I realized that so popular was this Durga Puja I had set up in Netherlands that it started being attended by Bengalis who were living in Belgium, where there was no Durga Puja, all over the Low Countries, etc. And there were even people coming all the way from London, which had Durga Puja, but they didn't have it as nicely as we had it because we had our theatre and our food and our music festival, etc., which has continued till today. And the young lady who has set up the Kolkata Museum, she was part of my Pujo committee, actually. The young lady who Shudip mentioned as the person who has taken this initiative, and she was in Leiden. So my interactions with the Bengali diaspora demonstrates that the Bengali diaspora from India have a very strong attachment to their culture, to their Durga Puja, to their music, and to their food. Because, as I said, you cannot detach a Bengali from his food. It's part of being Bengali. So the food is a very important part of it. And they are actually very well disposed also to the Indian mission if a little bit of sympathy and support is shown for their culture and their language and their traditions. Nirupama.
Thank you.
I'll have to take a minute here and read out Ambassador Rao's full comment.
Yes, please.
Congratulations on the book, Bhaswati. Tell us a little bit about the diaspora across the world. Anecdotally, I met American Congressman Hanson Clark in 2011 when I was ambassador there. He is of mixed Bengali and African American descent. His father was an immigrant from Sylhet, now in Bangladesh, who had come to America to work on the Ford motor car assembly line in the 1920s. Interesting to note that this migration of Bengalis from India's east was taking place in the early 20th century. Clark was very proud of his Bengali Bangladeshi origins, although he did not speak Bengali. He was raised as a Muslim, but converted later to Catholicism. Just wanted to put that out.
Amazing. What an amazing story. Yeah. Thank you for sharing it. Thank
you. Well, Bengalis have been everywhere, Ambassador. I mean, I've read this amazing story about how, the Bengalis, when they were sort of on British ships, of course, going east and all the way to New Zealand, there is this fascinating story about a Bengali from around Chittagong who showed up in one of the northern districts of New Zealand and actually took the moko. He got himself a Maori tattoo, married the headman's daughter, and thereafter did the most Bengali thing imaginable. He began to gather around the locals to go against the British. So there is such a thing, and it's been happening from the 1800s onwards globally. So we've been fomenting trouble.
We have been trouble for people from day one, correct?
Yeah. Sorry, Rekha. Sorry for the interruption. Do go ahead. Are there more?
There are a few more.
We have 5 minutes to go for the
Maybe
conversation.
You can read out 2 questions at a time. I would hate people to go with their questions unanswered. So
yes. Natarajan V says, why were the Bengali refugees in 1947 not part of the mainstream in West Bengal? He remembers growing up in Kolkata and that there were refugee camps even 20 years after partition. A second question by Shamit Ghosh: was the first partition of Bengal supported by Hindu Bengali politicians?
Well, I'll answer the second question first because that's very short answer. The first partition of Bengal was not supported by Hindu politicians. It was a scheme by Curzon to divide Bengalis forever on the basis of religion. It was supported by Muslims because Curzon fed them the poison narrative that they would be better off. He tried to give them better jobs in government, etc., etc. So when it was eliminated, when it was rescinded, the Muslims were furious. that the Hindus had managed to get the partition of Bengal of 1905 removed. The first question is very, very important. In a book discussion, Sudeep, that I had done for ORF two days ago, one of the speakers was a gentleman called Mr. Tathagat Roy, whom you probably know, who's written a lot about migration. And he, in fact, explained the most shocking story about these camps, which he said were given a very unfortunate name, which I don't even want to say. They were separated, and there was no effort made to integrate these refugees into the mainstream of Bengali life. Quite unlike what happened, for instance, in Bengal, in Delhi, where the Punjabi refugees not only were given support, but they actually, over a period of 4 or 5 years, and that's because these are very hardworking Punjabis refugees, they rebuilt their lives and became such an important part of the economic and political and social structure of India. So it's a very sorry and sad story of these refugee camps in Bengal, and I'll request Sudeep if he wants to fill in on this.
Well, I would be happy to, because but not for long, because I'd much rather that we get to answer.
Or maybe we can get the last two questions also. Yeah.
Yeah, but just very, very quickly, you're absolutely right, and this is absolutely shameful. The thing is that I think there was complete mismanagement, and there was a great sense of snobbery. So the upper middle class to middle class refugees who came into what is present day West Bengal, they were somehow more easily integrated. Some quite quickly and some over time.
Properties, Sudeep, they exchanged properties. Indeed. My grandfather did the same thing. Yeah.
Indeed, but some of the sort of I hate to use the word, but the lower classes and the lower castes, if you will, including the Matua, and I'm saying this specifically because the same leverage was used for the elections just passed, when the BJP actually leveraged the disappointment and the resentment of the continuing refugees, if you will. These refugees were actually shipped off to central India, to Madhya Pradesh and present-day Chhattisgarh, as sort of refugee camps were built for them there. Like the Tibetans spread all across India, the Bengali refugees from partition were actually sent away to other parts of India, other than have Bengal, several parts of Bengal be made their home, and that led to a massacre in Morijjhapi when these refugees came back when the communists took power in 1977 in West Bengal. Jyoti Basu's government sent the police and the home guards, the Bengal home guards, to evict refugees who was living on islands in the Sundarbans, because they just still didn't have, in 1979, from 1947 to 79, they still didn't have a home to call their own. And they were living off these tidal islands. Indeed, and that's tragic, and it continues to this day.
What is the next question? The last two questions, no, Lekha? You said two.
Indeed.
Yes, the last one. I think we have time for one question from Manmohan Reddy. Not having read the book, it appears that the discussion is a quote-unquote Bhadralok narrative. For example, in the 1940s, the Dalit leader Jogendranath Mondal joined hands with Ambedkar's All India Scheduled Caste Federation to oppose the partition of Bengal, whereas the Congress and the Hindu Mahasabha were largely united in wanting a Bengal divided largely on religious grounds. Gandhi, of course, was not in favor of that division. I don't think it's a question, it's just an observation that he made. If you'd like to comment on that.
Well, my comment is very short. I don't agree with his observation. First of all, it's not a Bhadralok narrative because I hate Bhadraloks. I don't come from any Bhadralok background actually, at all. Secondly, as far as the book is concerned, in the second last chapter, and I hope you will buy the book, I have explained in detail the absolute and utter confusion which reigned when people were asked to finally vote on whether they should opt for India or Pakistan or the status quo. I have explained the voting figures. I have explained in great detail that nobody actually knew at that time when they were voting, what were they voting for? And the voting was separate constituencies also. So no, it's not a Bhadralok narrative. It's a narrative about what happened in a very beloved part of India, my India, that's Bengal. The tragedy of the destruction of syncretism, and whether history can repeat itself. Because, as Hegel said, history, unless unchecked, can repeat itself. And in the final epilogue of my book, I have said that in my view, partition was not inevitable, and that partition happened also because India was let down by its leaders in its hour of need in 1947. Those were my conclusions on that book, and that is not a Bhadralok narrative, nor am I a Bhadralok. I think that Bhadraloks played a very destructive role from the 19th century till today. They opposed peasant reforms. They were snobs. They did not allow refugees to be settled in. So I would be very much appreciate if people neither call me a Bhadralok nor think that this is narrative which supports Bhadralok. It does not. Thank you. Sudeep.
Well, I think that's a good way to conclude this evening's discussion. And in fact, I support you completely with this conclusion that your last point that you made. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Ambassador Mukherjee, thanks so very much for joining us this evening. It's been my pleasure to discuss something that is close to my heart and to reconnect with my Didi, Bhashwati Di, as I've known her, and Ambassador Mukherjee to the rest of you, and Bhashwati Mukherjee to others, and Tota to the whole world. Tota Mukherjee to the whole world. So thank you again, Ambassador Mukherjee. Thank you very much, Bangalore International Center, and see you folks soon, all of you. And be well, stay safe. And Lekha might have the last word. Don't even imagine that you and I, Ambassador, have the last word this evening. Because Lekha of Bangalore International Center has the last word.
But I'll just say thank you also, and also to the BIC and to my batchmate, Jairaj. We call him Jerry, because he's the one who connected me to BIC, and he's here today. So thank you. And thank you very much.
All right, Lekha.
Lekha, please.
My pleasure. Lekha.
Thank you. Yes, I do have the last word, and I take that privilege very, very seriously. Thank you, Sudeep. It's always a pleasure to have you and to listen to you, Ambassador Mukherjee. So thank you for this fascinating book and for coming on our platform and having this lovely conversation. And thank you to all the Bengalis in the audience and for all the lovely questions and also the non-Bengalis who love Bengal so much. And this piece of history, which certainly I wasn't as aware, and hopefully this session and this book will start as young people, as millennials, digging more on unknown pieces of our history. Thank you so much. Good night and see you next time.